But old Athens and Jerusalem both have a lot to say, and Silicon Valley will become a dangerous place, as indeed it has. And we can talk more about that. Indeed it has, precisely because it's been divorced from these other cities.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Tertullian famously asked, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And what do either of these two cities have to do with Silicon Valley? Well, that's what we'll discuss today in light of a provocative new article that recently appeared in Wired magazine. We'll go through some of the key points and ideas introduced in this piece, and we'll do it with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon. So you survived the hurricane, huh?
Oh, man, yes. We barely survived. We, of course, live here in Orlando, which got hit pretty hard, not as bad as the coasts, but we had, I was telling you earlier, what's been described as a 500-year flood, like a once in every 500 years you get this much water. We had 2 feet plus of water in many places. Thankfully, we didn't get any water in our home, but lots of our neighbors did.
Do you have basements in Florida?
No, that's the saving grace. Is so very few people have basements, but it's the water just built up so quickly and had nowhere to drain that houses were flooded, roads were flooded, rivers overflowed. It was. I felt like Noah's Ark, and Noah. Like I live here on a farm with all these animals, so I wished I had an ark to load up all these animals and get them to safety.
I read that people saw alligators like just floating by in the Orlando area. I thought of you guys.
It was like down south. There were sharks in the street floating down the street.
Oh my goodness!
Which to me is terrifying.
It's like the Sharknado. Remember that?
Sharknado. Well, you and I are usually together virtually, but I had the great joy of spending some good time with you in person because our whole Word on Fire publishing team made a trip up there to Rochester, Minnesota to spend the day with you. And we thought it was delightful. I hope you did too.
Loved it. Love seeing everybody. And our little tour of downtown Rochester and the Mayo Clinic. But just seeing all you guys and hearing the plans for the future, which are really exciting. Our publishing branch has done so well, and we're not slowing down. On the contrary, we have all kinds of plans for the future. And then, new journals and academic work and more popular work, even things for kids. So all that's super exciting. And it was just some of the folks on your team I had never met before. I've been out in California and we've been hiring new people all the time. And so it was great to meet everybody.
Today I wanted to talk with you about this new Wired article. I've seen lots of other people discussing it online. It was written by Luke Burgess, friend of Word on Fire. He recently appeared on your Bishop Barron Presents series discussing Rene Girard, scapegoating, mimetic desire. So Luke wrote the article. It's titled The 3-City Problem of Modern Life, the 3-city problem of modern life. The 3 cities he's referring to are Athens, Jerusalem, and Silicon Valley. He begins with that famous quote, which I cited earlier from Tertullian, who said, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Let's start there. What did Tertullian mean by this?
Well, he meant at the time, what does rational philosophy have to do with the revelation? And he was on the side of Jerusalem as he read it, that God has spoken and has revealed his will and purpose to us. And so why are we bothering with Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and everybody else? I mean, who cares? And so once we got Jerusalem, who needs Athens? But the mainstream of our tradition has never sided with Tertullian. We've never felt that was the right way to go. In fact, you could say the Reformation represents in a way a recovery of Tertullian. When Luther refers to reason as a whore, famously, that whore reason, and has no time for Aristotle and so on. You might say it's a recovery of this, option for Jerusalem radically over Athens, when most of our tradition would side more with Augustine and Aquinas, who would have said, no, both Athens and Jerusalem, both faith and reason. So that's where that famous quote comes from.
So Luke Burgess says, look, we've had this centuries-long back and forth between Athens and Jerusalem, faith and reason, theology and philosophy, science and faith, however you want to depict it. But he says today there is a third city affecting the other two, namely Silicon Valley. I'm going to quote a couple sentences from his article. He says, this third city is not governed primarily by reason. And then parenthetically, he adds, it is practically the mark of a great entrepreneur in Silicon Valley to not be reasonable, nor, he says, is it governed by the things of the soul. The dominant belief in Silicon Valley seems to be a form of materialism. It is a place, rather, governed by the creation of value. And a large component of value is utility, whether something is useful or at least perceived as good or beneficial. He then quotes Shane Parrish, who is a Silicon Valley investor and podcast host, who says, the real test of an idea isn't whether it's true, but whether it's useful. In other words, utility trumps truth or reason. What's your initial impression about that proposal?
Well, there's a complex set of issues there, Brandon, because if you talk about utility, usefulness, you always have to ask, well, useful to what end? Useful to what purpose? There's got to be at least implicitly some sense of the true or the good if you're going to speak about the useful. But I do take his point that for someone, let's say, in the world of, the Facebook world and Silicon Valley communications, questions of like philosophical truth, is that the right idea? Or questions of moral rectitude, is that the right thing to do? Seem to be much less important than, am I successfully, propagating my product? Am I successfully attracting advertisers? Am I getting clicks and attention? Those seem to be the primary motivators. And if I can get a lot of clicks and attention from something which is patently false, well, all right, fair enough. If I can get lots of clicks and attention and subscribers and advertisers from something that's morally questionable, well, all right, all's fair in love and war. So I think that's what he's putting his finger on, is that problem. And it's driven, I would say, by economics, finally. What's driving advertisers to my site? What's giving me clicks, which in turn will increase my income, et cetera? If I'm dominated by that, by money, well, then the true and the good fall to the side pretty quickly. Now, that's an old problem in human life. It's just being given a new expression now.
Luke Burgess notes that humanity is at a crossroads. He says, we are trying to reconcile various needs for rationality, for worship, for productivity, and the tension of this pursuit shows up in the things we create. Because the three cities are interacting, we are now living with technology-mediated religion, for example, online church services, and technology-mediated reason, for example, 280-character Twitter debates. I think what he's driving at is we're trying to maximize the use of technology toward certain ends. So when we apply it to religion, it's let's try to get our message, our sermon to as many people as possible, even if they're at home. Or when it comes to Twitter, let's try to interact with as many people and as many ideas as possible. But it seems to be getting back to that question of, but is that good? What would Athens and Jerusalem have to say about technology-driven churches or Twitter?
Yeah, as long as they're used as tools. So the technology available to us today is a sophisticated tool, just as the printing press was at the time a very sophisticated tool, just as the parchment and Roman roads that Paul used were sophisticated tools in his time. Fine. As long as they're being used for a higher purpose and with conscious intent, fine, use them. But what happens, it's the whole Frankenstein's monster thing, is when the tool takes over. And that now we get into the whole AI debate and all that, but when the very tools that we've developed, as it were, turn on us, or they become our dominant concern, and we start bracketing epistemic questions and moral questions, now we've got a very serious problem. And that's why, to use Burgess's language, that Silicon Valley and Athens and Jerusalem have to be not only in conversation, but I think clearly Silicon Valley has to be subordinate to both Athens and Jerusalem. If they stand for the intellectual and the spiritual, they have to contain the means that are used to propagate them. If it turns the other way around, now we've got a serious problem. if we bracket the true, the good, the spiritual, in order to allow this, tool to come to full expression, well, then we've just lost our way. I think that's the real danger he's putting his finger on.
At one point in his article, he offers this interesting thought experiment. He says, if the Enlightenment champion Steven Pinker, a resident of Athens, if you will, pure reason, enlightenment, if Steven Pinker walked into a bar with a Trappist monk, who might be representative of Jerusalem, and the two of them met Elon Musk, the champion of Silicon Valley, with the goal of solving a particular problem, would Steven Pinker, the Trappist monk, and Elon Musk ever arrive at a consensus? What do you think?
My suspicion is no, and I go back to my Alistair McIntyre, reading that we've lost a common vocabulary, a common moral vocabulary. Would those three people share the same ends? See, if people share the same ends, morally speaking, they can deliberate about means. So what's the best way for us to accomplish whatever this moral purpose is? Or if there's a consensus around the nature of the true, then we can debate and we can argue about, means to that end. But it's our friend Chesterton, men today have lost their way. Well, so what? Men have always lost their way. The difference is today they've lost their address. And in other words, they used to at least know where they were supposed to be going. So we've always lost our way on the path home, but at least we knew where home was. But now we don't know where home is. So I don't know if those three men would have enough in common. Let's say Pinker, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, let's throw off the shackles of medieval obscurantism. Let's let the modern sciences express themselves. And then politically, let's allow for ever greater freedom. Those are two great ideals of the Enlightenment. Okay, as far as they go, but they've got to be situated within higher moral ends. If we bracket the religious and philosophical from that, we've got serious problems, which indeed has happened. Elon Musk, I don't know. His goal seems to be, the expansion of technology. So we got smarter and smarter cars and, driverless cars eventually. We get rocket ships that will go even to Mars and colonize. But, my nephew Drew works at SpaceX, and he's working on some of those things. I remember I asked him one day, I said, well, but what would we do once we get to Mars? And I was meant to tease him with that sort of philosophical question, like, okay, yeah, we could probably develop technology to get us to Mars, but if so, so what? Now, his answer, by the way, was pretty good. He said something like, well, it's just good to come to know more and more about the world. It's good to explore. And that's a decent answer. It motivated Columbus and it motivated, the great explorers of the 16th century. Okay. But that's a moral end. That's a kind of epistemic purpose. So the key, I think, again, is to keep all three of these cities in dialogue with each other. Silicon Valley is probably now would be like the sexiest of the three. It would be the one that most intrigues us, most gets our attention. But old Athens and Jerusalem both have a lot to say. And Silicon Valley will become a dangerous place, as indeed it has. And we could talk more about that. Indeed it has, precisely because it's been divorced from these other cities.
Luke Burgess, I think, agrees with you that there needs to be dialogue between these three cities. In fact, he says our failure to understand the three-city problem is causing many people to isolate in one city or another without even realizing it.
Yeah.
He says academics, for example, confine themselves to academic burrows and occupy themselves in the life of reason. Some Christians are calling for the adoption of a Benedict option, the case for communal religious life with boundaries separating it from the broader culture. And then Silicon Valley engineers immerse themselves in the ecosystem or the metaverse where capital and contacts flow freely, but where, he says in this beautiful image, a sandal-wearing Franciscan friar walking down the streets of Palo Alto in a brown robe could easily be mistaken for an eccentric founder of a Silicon Valley startup. He says there's little cross-cultural literacy, and the extent to which people begin clustering in one of these three cities, the extent to which they isolate, fortify the walls, close the gates, is the extent to which our culture suffers. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And, it came to mind as you were reading that, Brandon, was John Henry Newman and his sense of the different dimensions of the church's life, the priestly, prophetic, and kingly. And when they get isolated from each other, we have trouble. So take our three examples here. What happens when Athens and Jerusalem are divorced from each other? Well, Athens becomes rationalistic. When you bracket the symbolic, the mystical, the ultimate meaning, the religious side of life, it devolves into a kind of Enlightenment rationalism. There were forms of it in the Middle Ages too. And that's something very cramped and arid. Now, divorce Jerusalem from Athens. What happens to Jerusalem? It can become superstitious. When you take the reasonable element out of religion, you stop theologizing. So Newman said one of the marks of a healthy Christianity is it stubbornly thinks about revelation. It asks critical questions. It engages the wider culture. So a believer who says, look, the Bible is the basis of my life, but I'm willing to use philosophy or science to reach out to the wider world. Well, now I'm in the spirit of Thomas Aquinas. And it's healthier for religion. It's like bringing some fresh air into what can become a stuffy, no longer mystical, but now superstitious space. Okay, so there's Athens and Jerusalem. Now, separate the two of them from Silicon Valley, as I think Burgess is using it. Well, they can both become eccentric and self-contained. If Silicon Valley is a means of communication, and honestly, that's how we're using it, Brandon. I mean, we're using a lot of the technology made available to us. God knows it's got a negative side, and I've talked about it a lot. I know all about it, so don't write me a letter about it. I know how negative the social media space can be. Nevertheless, we'd be derelict indeed if we didn't use it. And that's both, I think, the world of academia, the world of the university, and the world of religion. If we don't find a way to use this as a means of not just communication, but also connection, I don't underplay that. That Facebook and its cousins and so on have made possible a level of connectedness that is extraordinary and good. It's got a shadow side because we live in a sinful world, but it's good. So I guess I would bring the Newman hermeneutic to bear. We want reason, we want faith, we want communication, all to be in a healthy dialogue with each other. And then it's to the mutual benefit of all three.
I thought Luke makes another interesting suggestion here. The path forward is grounded on mutual communication. We need to get these three cities talking with each other. But he also offers another idea. He says we should start taking anthropology seriously again. He says the three-city problem is a question of foundations. In each city, there is a different conception of what it means to be human. And each one, he says, is reductionist. We can only build things as great as our anthropological vision. The problem, for example, in Silicon Valley is the transhumanist movement. He says the problem isn't that it does too much, but that it wants to do too little. Humans are often treated as merely upgradable computers that need some hardware and software adjustments to become less buggy, and not as creatures made to worship. Or, he quotes your hero, Bob Dylan, creatures that gotta serve somebody. How important is this anthropological question when it comes to these three cities?
Yeah, it's hyper important, it seems to me. I mean, who are we? What's our ultimate purpose? What is the human being ordered to? See, that's, as you know, Brandon, after the rise of modernity, when efficient and material causality became the dominant categories, and formal and final causality were more or less bracketed. But for Aristotle and the great tradition going right up to the modern period, the most important of the four causes were the formal and the final. So what is the basic structure of something? Think of, in our moral debates today, how that question is completely bracketed. Who am I as a human being? And therefore, following from those formal considerations, what's my purpose? What's the purpose of my life as a whole? What's the purpose of my intellectual life? What's the purpose of my affective life? What's the purpose of my sexual life? What's the purpose of my body? Well, I mean, bracket all that. I mean, that's the contemporary voice. Bracket all of that. That's just up to the individual to decide. But see, gosh, the great tradition up till very recent times thought those were the most important questions. And Burgess's language, that's called anthropology. That's called philosophical or theological anthropology. Who are we? What are we built for? What's our purpose? If we don't know that, then you don't know how to live your life. And if you say, oh, make it up, that's like saying that a bunch of kids go out in a baseball field and just make up a game. They'll devolve. I mean, you're a father of 8 kids. What will happen if you told your kids, go out in the baseball field and just make up any game you want? It'll devolve into bickering in about 45 seconds, right? Rather, the joy is, no, here, let me tell you about baseball. Let me explain this game to you, which is marvelous and has been developed over decades and decades, and has great stars who exemplify it at the highest levels. And let me show you how to play it. And then you find your own way to play it. That's true. You can play it in your own unique manner, but you're playing baseball. You're not playing something that you're making up. So in a similar way with human life, hey, I just make it up. I'm going to make it all up from scratch. Well, I mean, bore me to death with that. And what happens? We'll start bickering with each other because your vision and mine will be so totally different. There'll be no cooperation. But if we say, no, together we're all about the project of being truly human. And you, Brandon, will live it in a unique way, which is beautiful, So I'm not saying we become automatons. We become like, the people in Maoist China, all look and move and act exactly the same way. No, not that. But you enter creatively into the objective demand of human life. So that's anthropology, quite rightly construed. And when that's bracketed, the very troubles we see today follow like night follows day.
Here's how Luke Burgess closes his article. He says, if we don't feel whole, or if we find technology leaving us wanting, it is because we have sold ourselves short. But there is a broader and fuller vision of humanity that we can recover. The most important innovations of the coming decades will happen at the intersection of these 3 cities, and they will be created by the people who live there.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's right. Like willy-nilly, we live in the 3 cities. It's not as though I can declare myself independent of these 3 things, because Athens today would probably stand for scientific reason. In Tertullian's time, it was philosophical reason, but probably science today would be Athens. Well, look, I can't bracket science and pretend it's not there. Religion is, as I've argued for years, is a fundamental dynamic of human life. It's Paul Tillich called it ultimate concern. I can't escape that. Everyone has ultimate concern. And then say what you want about Silicon Valley. We can't escape it. It's like King Canute and the waves. I mean, you couldn't possibly say I'm just going to abstract my life from all that. You can't. You got to find the best way to engage it. And I'd say engage it as a tool of communication and community governed by a coherent anthropology and by reason and by faith. And if you do that, I think you can live happily in these 3 cities.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you'd like to ask Bishop Barron a question, send it in at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we hear from Kevin in Canada, and he's got a good question that loops into the themes we've been discussing today, namely concerning neuroscience and the soul. Here's his question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name's Kevin Murray, and I'm from Montreal, Canada. And I was curious as to how you feel about the field of neuroscience and how it fits in with your understanding of the soul. The church tends to teach that consciousness arises both from material and immaterial, whereas neuroscience really just tends to stick to the material. So I was wondering how you go about reconciling the 2. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. We spent a lot of time at this recent conference in Rome talking about that, because there were neuroscience people there and AI people and all that. And I would say you're probably right in saying that neuroscience by its very nature is ordered toward what can be empirically measured and so on. So to that degree, neuroscience studies the brain and brain physiology and synapses and chemical reactions and all of that, all of which is involved, it's ingredient in what we call consciousness. The church would say, not just the church, but I'd say the philosophical tradition classically would say there's a dimension to consciousness that can't be reduced to merely physical processes. And the reason is the mind's capacity at the highest levels to engage in real abstract cognition. So, for example, make it simple. When your mind grasps the definition of a circle, well, that's not something you are imagining because you can't imagine it. I can't create a true circle in the real world. It'll always be imperfect, right? I now have an image in my mind of a circular object. That's not a circle. That's a image that's suggestive of this thing, though, that I truly understand. When I understand the nature of a circle, everything equally distant from a central point, etc. But I can't imagine that. Or take the number 7. You have the number 7. Now 7 plus 3 equals 10. Have that in your mind. Well, I can look at 7 things here on the table and 3 things there, and I can bring them together. Oh, like there are 10 things. Or I can imagine 7 things and 3 things, and okay, no, there's 10 of them. But that's not what I'm talking about. When I say I understand that 7 plus 3 equals 10, that's a sheer abstraction. Numbers aren't physical. They're not. They're spiritual, if you want. I'll use David Tracy's language. They're invisible. They belong to the invisible realm. I think one of the great ironies is that the very thing that drives people often toward a materialism, namely the sciences, are in fact invaded at every turn by the invisible. Because you can't do science today. You couldn't do it really from Newton on without high-level mathematics, right? Especially postmodern science. You can't do it without high-level mathematical abstraction. Well, that means the invisible is inescapably ingredient in science itself. And so don't follow the false logic that says, oh, the natural sciences lead me toward a naturalism. In fact, they don't. In fact, the deeper you go into them, the more you see the prominence of the invisible. Now, this is the last step. The objectively invisible, like numbers and pure forms and mathematical equations, etc., can only be grasped by a mind that shares their nature, right? If you say the mind is just synapses and just physical reactions and just cells and so on, then it can't contain, it can't entertain these pure invisibilities. And that's the argument classically for the immateriality of the mind. That, to my mind, is completely untouched by any of the findings of contemporary neuroscience, which are fine and interesting and all that. But you can't talk about, let's say, a robot or a pure AI invention being capable of this sort of self-conscious and reflective cognitive perception of invisibilities. And that's why you need to talk about the immateriality of the soul.
Well, a new year is right around the corner, and I'm not talking about 2023. I'm talking about the new liturgical year, which begins on the first Sunday of Advent, November 27th. And if you're looking for something to help you in this upcoming liturgical year, we have a great new book from Peter Kreeft titled Food for the Soul, Reflections on the Mass Readings for Cycle A. Last year, we released a volume in this series that took us through the previous liturgical year. This is the sequel. This includes readings and reflections from Peter Kreeft, who has been described as a modern G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis. His trademark blend of gentle wit and wisdom is visible on every page. So check it out. It's a great way to stay in touch with the readings from Mass for each Sunday and the major feasts and solemnities. You can find more at the website wordonfire.org/food, wordonfire.org/food, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Thank you.